The story of Shedeur Sanders in the Cleveland Browns did not begin on draft night, though draft night is where most people think it started. It began long before that, in the laboratories of NFL scouting, in the combine measurements and the private workouts, and the film sessions where scouts and executives and coaches sat in darkened rooms and looked at footage of a young man playing quarterback and tried to reduce what they saw to a set of variables that could be entered into a system and produce a reliable projection of future professional performance. That process, the process of NFL evaluation, is imperfect by design. It has always been imperfect. It will always be imperfect. Because football players are not variables, they are human beings. And human beings have a persistent habit of refusing to behave the way the models predict they will behave. Shedeur Sanders, more than almost any prospect in recent draft history, exposed the limits of that evaluation process. He exposed them before the draft, when his college numbers, historically significant numbers, numbers that placed him among the most productive quarterbacks in the history of college football, were met with skepticism rather than recognition. He exposed them during the draft process, when every conversation about him eventually turned to the same set of concerns: the size, the arm, the father, the platform, the question of whether what people were seeing was a great quarterback or a great college quarterback at a program that had been specifically constructed to showcase his abilities. These are not illegitimate questions. In the business of evaluating football talent, every question deserves to be asked. But questions asked in bad faith, questions asked as a way to reach a predetermined conclusion rather than as a genuine attempt to understand the truth, are a different thing entirely. And for Shedeur Sanders, the questions being asked about him carried a weight and a tone and a consistency that suggested the conclusion had been reached before the evidence was fully considered. The draft night slide was the public expression of that process reaching its outcome. Pick after pick, round after round, the cameras finding his face, his family's faces, the faces of people who had watched him outperform every standard that had been set for him, and who were now watching an industry tell him, in the most public way imaginable, that he had still somehow not done enough. The reaction from the public was massive and immediate and deeply personal for a huge number of people, not just sports fans, but people who recognized in Shedeur's experience something that spoke to a much larger truth about how talent is evaluated, and who gets the benefit of the doubt, and who is made to prove themselves over and over and over again, regardless of what the evidence shows. When Shedeur was finally selected by the Cleveland Browns, the reaction inside his camp was composed, public, dignified. There was no explosion of emotion, no dramatic statement, no declaration of what was going to happen next. There was just the acknowledgement of the moment, and the quiet, unmistakable signal from a young man who had been through enough to know that the only response to being doubted is to perform. That is what he came to Cleveland to do. That is what he was going to do. And that is exactly what happened. The Cleveland Browns, as an organization, came into the 2025 offseason with a specific vision of how they were going to approach the quarterback situation. They had made their selection. They had their player. But the plan, as communicated through the various channels of NFL organizational messaging, was measured and careful. Development takes time. The transition from college to professional football is never simple, regardless of how decorated the college career was. The rookie would be given every opportunity to compete and develop, but the organization's timeline for when that development would translate into a starting role was going to be determined by the organization, on the organization's terms, and the outside world was going to have to be patient while that process unfolded.
That plan lasted approximately as long as it took Shedeur Sanders to take his first full practice reps with the Cleveland Browns' first-team offense. What the coaches saw in those first days was not what they had expected to see on the timetable they had expected to see it. The NFL evaluation process had told everyone that this was a player who needed time, who needed to adjust to the speed of the professional game, to the complexity of professional defensive schemes, to the physicality and the pressure and the thousand small differences between playing quarterback in college and playing quarterback on Sundays against the best defensive players in the world. The evaluation process had been very clear on this point. The concerns were well documented, the reasons for patience were well established, and then the player showed up and performed in ways that made the reasons for patience feel less like wisdom and more like an organizational habit of managing expectations rather than responding to reality. The reads were immediate, not just the physical read, the quarterback's eyes moving through the progression and identifying the open receiver, but the mental read, the understanding of what the defense was trying to do before the snap, the ability to process pre-snap information and translate it into post-snap decisions with a speed that comes not from athletic ability, but from football intelligence. This is the quality that is hardest to evaluate in the pre-draft process. You can time a player's 40-yard dash, you can measure his hand size, you can chart his completion percentage against various coverages in college. But the speed at which a quarterback's brain works, the depth of his football understanding, the quality of his decision-making under pressure, the ability to be right more often than he is wrong in the split-second environment of NFL quarterbacking, that is a quality that reveals itself slowly, over time, in the daily grind of professional preparation. Except with Shedeur Sanders, it was not revealing itself slowly. It was there from the beginning, fully formed, undeniable. Veteran players on the Browns roster were among the first to articulate what they were seeing. Veterans are the most honest evaluators in professional football because they have no stake in the organizational messaging, no interest in managing narratives or protecting timelines. They see what they see and they say what they say. And when veteran players, particularly veteran skill position players who have worked with multiple quarterbacks at the professional level and who understand from their own careers what separates the ones who can play from the ones who cannot, start saying that a rookie quarterback is the real thing, it means something. It means something that no press release and no depth chart decision and no carefully worded coaching staff statement can contradict. The receivers noticed first, the way he saw them, the way the ball arrived in the right place at the right time, not just the accurate place, but the place that allowed them to catch and run, that gave them the opportunity to do something after the catch rather than simply securing the ball and absorbing contact. This is called anticipatory throwing, and it is one of the rarest and most valuable skills a quarterback can possess. You throw to where the receiver is going to be, not where he is. You trust your read, you trust your timing, and you let the ball go before the window fully opens, knowing that by the time it arrives, the window will be there. College quarterbacks who do this consistently against college defenses are celebrated. Professional quarterbacks who do it consistently against NFL defenses are franchise cornerstones. Shedeur Sanders was doing it in practice. He was doing it in preseason. And the people watching up close were running out of ways to explain away what they were seeing. The media, the same media that had spent months cataloging the concerns about his readiness, that had given substantial airtime and column inches to the voices questioning whether his college production would translate, that had, in some cases, seemed almost invested in the narrative of him being a project rather than a player, was slow to update. This is not unusual. The sports media ecosystem runs on narratives, and narratives have momentum. Once a story about a player has been established, once the framework through which a player is understood has been set, it takes a significant amount of contradictory evidence to dislodge it. The human mind, and the media institution as an extension of human minds, resists updating its priors. It finds ways to incorporate new evidence into the existing framework rather than replacing the framework with a new one. And so the early practice reports that suggested something remarkable was happening with Shedeur Sanders in Cleveland were treated cautiously. They were acknowledged, but qualified. surrounded by reminders of the concerns that had been raised during the evaluation process, framed as encouraging but preliminary. The media was not ready to say that the narrative had been wrong. It was not ready to say that the people who had questioned his readiness had been wrong. It was going to need more time, more evidence, more proof that what was happening in practice was going to translate to what would happen in games. Shedeur understood this. He had been dealing with this version of the skepticism equation his entire career. In college, every impressive performance was met with qualifications about the level of competition or the system he was playing in, or the advantages provided by playing in his father's program. The goalposts had always moved. The standard had always been recalibrated upward the moment he met it. He had learned not to expect the validation to come easily or quickly. He had learned that his job was not to convince the doubters through argument, but to perform at a level that made argument irrelevant. And that is what he was doing, systematically, relentlessly, without drama or complaint, just performance, accumulating day after day into a body of evidence that was growing too large to contain within the existing narrative framework. The preseason games were where the first cracks appeared in the media's reluctance to update. When Shedeur stepped into live game action, when he faced professional defensive personnel in a setting that, while not the regular season, was real enough to provide meaningful information about his professional readiness, the results demanded engagement. The processing speed that had been visible in practice was visible against real defenses. The decision-making held up under the pressure of live action. The ball placement, the timing, the ability to manage the pocket and extend plays and find solutions when the designed play broke down, all of it performed at a level that could not be explained away by the quality of practice competition or the advantages of working with a first-team offense in a controlled environment. Social media exploded each time he played. Every clip that emerged from preseason games became a content event. The analytics community, which had been cautiously optimistic based on his college numbers and which had the quantitative framework to contextualize what they were seeing in professional settings, began producing analysis that supported what the eyeball test was already showing. The numbers were there. The metrics were there. The evidence from every analytical angle was pointing in the same direction. The media began to move, not quickly and not uniformly, but perceptibly. Voices that had been among the most vocal about his limitations began to acknowledge that the early returns were more positive than expected. Analysts who had spent months explaining why the concerns about his readiness were legitimate began spending equal time explaining why the early signs of his success were significant. The narrative was shifting, slowly, reluctantly, but undeniably shifting, and with it came the beginning of a reckoning. Not a dramatic public admission of error, because the sports media does not typically produce those, but a quiet, gradual realignment of the framework through which Shedeur Sanders was being understood. The moment that crystallized everything, the moment that even the most stubborn skeptics in the media could not explain away, came in the context of the Browns' internal quarterback competition. The organization's plan had been to manage the situation carefully, to avoid making a decision before they were certain, to protect the process from the external pressure that was building with every positive report and every viral clip. But the player had not been cooperative with that plan. He had been too good, too consistent, too clearly the best option for this football team at this moment in time. And the organization, to its credit, had been honest enough to acknowledge what it was seeing, rather than forcing a predetermined outcome onto a situation that had already decided itself. When the Browns committed to Shedeur Sanders as their starting quarterback, the announcement carried a weight that was different from a typical depth chart decision. It was a validation, not just by one organization of one player's readiness, but of the larger truth that had been trying to assert itself since draft night. The truth that the evaluation process had underestimated him, that the concerns had been overstated, that the readiness he had been denied in the draft room was real and present and visible to anyone who was willing to see it honestly. The media that had questioned his readiness was now covering his ascent to the starting role. The analysts who had spent months explaining why the concerns about his readiness were legitimate began spending equal time explaining why the early signs of his success were significant. The narrative was shifting,
slowly, reluctantly, but undeniably shifting, and with it came the beginning of a reckoning, not a dramatic public admission of error, because the sports media does not typically produce those, but a quiet, gradual realignment of the framework through which Shedeur Sanders was being understood. Shedeur Sanders asked about the journey, about the draft night, about the doubters, about the people who had said he was not ready, said what people of genuine character say when they have been proven right and could be forgiven for saying so loudly. He said thank you to the people who believed in him. He said he had work to do. He said the real story was just beginning, and that everything that had happened so far was just the foundation for what was coming next. He did not name the people who doubted him. He did not religate the draft, or the coverage, or the months of skepticism he had navigated on his way to this moment. He looked forward, because that is what this kind of player does. That is what this kind of person does. And in a sports world full of drama and noise and the easy gratification of calling out your critics, the composure and the forward focus were their own kind of statement, louder in their way than anything he could have said in anger.
The Cleveland Browns had found their quarterback. The NFL had found its next great story. And the media, the same media that had spent months explaining why he was not ready, was now scrambling to be part of telling it. They said he was not ready. The draft board said it. The analysts said it. The narrative said it for months in every format, on every platform, with a confidence that was supposed to feel permanent. But Shedeur Sanders came to Cleveland and did what great players always do when they are told they are not enough. He proved it wrong. Not with words, not with complaints, with football, with preparation, with the quiet, devastating competence of someone who always knew the truth and was simply waiting for the moment when everyone else caught up. The wait is over. The doubters have been exposed, and the real story of Shedeur Sanders in the NFL has only just begun. This video is based on publicly available reports, sports media coverage, NFL practice reports, preseason analysis, draft coverage, and ongoing developments surrounding Shedeur Sanders and the Cleveland Browns as of the time of production. Some details regarding internal organizational decisions and locker room dynamics are drawn from industry reporting and sourced accounts and have not been independently verified. This content is intended for informational and entertainment purposes only and does not represent the official positions of the Cleveland Browns, the NFL, Shedeur Sanders, or any other individual or organization mentioned.